Welcome to our event, Lawyering Under Authoritarianism. We have a really amazing panel. Super excited about this. So let's jump right in because I know I want to hear as much from these folks as I can. So I'm going to let you all introduce yourselves. But so if you could just each introduce yourself and the work that you do, and just briefly share kind of what brought you to your current work. Whoever wants to start. I'm going to call on Seema.
Hi, everyone. My name's Seema. I'm actually based out of Toronto. I went to law school in the US and I worked in New Orleans and St. Louis before I moved back home. But I've been following things really closely in the US, so thanks for having me. I'm curious if anyone else is from Canada. Can you put it in the chat if anyone else is originally from Canada? I'm always looking for other Canadians, maybe trying to come home. But yeah, I guess I made it to law school. I come from the anti-war, anti-imperialism movement. My family's from Iran, and I went to law school with the illusion that human rights were real and not just like a not just kind of the US throwing its power around in the world. So I thought that's what I would study. When I ended up in law school, it was around the same time as the uprisings in Ferguson and a lot of anti-foreclosure organizing that was happening in the Northeast. And so I ended up actually going deeply local and working with people who are organizing around that and seeing how lawyers could support that work that communities were doing. And that's what ended up bringing me down to New Orleans and then St. Louis. And I'm back home now, where I started a legal collective called the Community Justice Collective with four other lawyers who have also come out of organizing in Canada. And we specifically exist to give politically aligned lawyers and free lawyers to people who are organizing. And this came out of COVID organizing in Canada. There isn't really a tradition of lawyers working with organizers, and often it's lawyers working at big firms that will give their pro bono hours and not actually be politically aligned with people. So we end up kind of representing anyone that's doing collective and politicized work in mostly Toronto. So that has led to support for rent strikes, people protesting around Palestine, workers, especially non-unionized workers that are fighting back against their bosses, and really whatever collectives are pushing back, helping them address the legal retaliation that almost all of them will face. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Maybe Alec, you can jump in.
Absolutely. So my name's Alec. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I work in an organization called Civil Rights Corps. I started my career as a public defender in Alabama and then in Washington, D.C. And over the last 10 years or so have been doing more complex civil rights class action cases mostly, but not exclusively, to challenge the size and power and profit of the punishment bureaucracy in the United States, and really thinking about how to use those cases also as kind of counter propaganda uh, vehicles for subverting and disturbing some of the narratives and mythologies that underlie these widespread support for the legitimacy of the punishment bureaucracy. So really thinking about how to use in our cases storytelling and partnerships with organizers and artists and others to kind of change the conversation or just have a really different conversation about what the punishment bureaucracy is doing and why. And so that's kind of the work that we do at CRC, and why I particularly have been so interested in the kind of attitudes and assumptions and beliefs and intuitions that make possible an authoritarian moment. And then in recent years have become, some might say, obsessed. I would say just interested in um, the role of liberal institutions, in particular, universities, nonprofits, the Democratic Party in the United States. I think you call them the liberals in Canada. Um, but what are the role of these institutions as sort of counterinsurgency operations, as entities that actually play a really crucial role in the sort of like in both government repression and in kind of undermining any sort of meaningful mass resistance movements to that repression and to the people who profit from that repression. So that's how I come to this conversation.
Thank you.
I'll go now. My name is Sofia Veronica Montes, they, them pronouns. I am a staff attorney with Project South. Project South was founded in 1986 as the Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide in Atlanta, Georgia. I am personally located in Lakewood, Colorado, but I work remotely in this organization that's in the South. I have a very strong tie to the South myself. I was well, a little bit of a life story. I was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela, where I spent the first 17 and a half years of my life, then migrated to the United States and spent the subsequent 12 or so years in North Carolina. And I have currently spent a couple of years in Colorado, where I'm currently based. And so, having spent that time in North Carolina, having spent so nearly half of my lifetime in the South, very much has led me to feel this sort of identification and attachment with the region, and overall with the plight of the immigrant struggle and the struggle for self-determination from state repression, more generally speaking, especially as a displaced brown person who will not get to die in their home country. And that is something that I very much relate to in terms of like diaspora and the fact that we are here whether through will or circumstance. And that is basically why I am so drawn to this work, because I gotta make sure that my community is safe. I gotta make sure that we are safe and that we are thriving to the best of our capability. As for Project South itself, it is an anchor organization across the southern United States with ties to the global south. So our executive director, for instance, goes on transcontinental network uh, like commissions emissions to Africa, connecting with the Afriki network for Pan-Africanism, bringing some of that knowledge in the fight against colonialism back home and bringing some of our knowledge organizing in the South to the continent as well. We are very much led and guided by the maxim by W.E.B. Du Bois that as the South goes, so does the country. So that guides our organizing, that guides our political and legal action. Our legal and advocacy team specifically is guided by the principle of countering state repression. And so we do that by trying to democratize, so to speak, access and knowledge of the law, which oftentimes we do with Know Your Rights, Know and Defend Your Rights workshops. We do by monitoring the legislative session in the state of Georgia, keeping track of all the horrible bills, horrible anti-immigrant dehumanizing bills that are introduced and often passed, and trying to spread that knowledge and awareness to our communities that do not have this legalese, jargony language that we are trained to speak in, and that these legislations are by design drafted to be written by. Something that is very mystifying for most normal human beings. And so we try to demystify that, just try to translate into normal people language what is going on. Um, Aside from that, all just keeping track of various modes in which the state is weaponizing its code of law against our vulnerable communities. Personally, much of my work has revolved around utilities access, utilities meaning water, electricity, gas, that a lot of households around the South are denied access to on the basis of not providing a social security number. Something that, as you'll gather, is disproportionately applies to undocumented households that, regardless of their civil immigration status, need running water. So that's where I'm coming here. That's my background and perspective and where I'm coming from in today's presentation today. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So kind of diving in, as you know, you kind of talked about, each of you has kind of been on the front lines like of legal advocacy for marginalized people in different ways. But like, when did it first become clear to you that the U.S. was like, at least on a larger scale, veering kind of towards authoritarianism? And how did that realization kind of shift your work or your sense of responsibility as a lawyer? And I would say, you know, given the focus of your work, does it feel like this is something new and different, or is it kind of are there some ways where we're kind of applying some of the same structures that you all have been fighting, on in more localized ways, or in specific areas of law that is just now hitting everything? Like, I'm just curious about your thoughts on those ideas. Sorry, that was a long question.
I can take a stab at that. I didn't hear if you directed it particularly at someone,
Oh, just
but
whoever.
um, just to, I find the silences on Zooms to be really difficult to endure. So um, um, I'll just take a stab at it really quickly, but I'm interested to hear what others have to say too, because this can be kind of an isolating moment. Because I think on the left in the legal profession, one of the defining characteristics of, at least of my own experience in my career, has been the we've been so siloed, both because of philanthropy and sort of the nonprofit culture tends to focus a lot on issue areas and less so on kind of building an organized like genuine left. Um, and so, it can feel really isolating because I don't think it's possible to even address these problems in any kind of like I work on housing or I work on the criminal punishment system or I do, I represent student protesters. I mean, like all of these problems are and have very similar origins and so those of us thinking about the rise of authoritarianism in the narrow world of like the civil rights community or even the community that even within that community explicitly and directly works on like repression, like punishment bureaucracy and police prosecutors and judges who are the people that we usually sue. It can be really isolating, and I am really curious to hear from folks who are thinking in these other realms too. I always learn so much. But for me, in my little corner, I feel like the system that I've come up fighting against has always been fascist. It's a fascist corner of our society. It's the corner of our society where the tremendous inequalities and contradictions in our values and brutality of the global world order that we've set up is actually visited on people's bodies and minds and families and communities and within that little realm, it's hard to say that you know it hasn't been a horrific and overwhelming kind of authoritarian repressive emergency for a long time. Um, that being said, I do think there's a couple of differences that have emerged in the last few years. One is the system that I grew up in, starting my legal career in, uh, seemed like there was at least some pretense, or at least there was some need for the system to preserve its own legitimacy, to try to correct any gaps that were pointed out to it between the values that it articulated and the outcomes that it produced. I think that has changed a lot. Rather, a lot of the people within the judicial bureaucracy and the policing and prosecutorial bureaucracies, um, when you point out these gaps before, they might feel some need to preserve their own legitimacy to correct them. Whereas now, huge swaths of those systems revel in those gaps. They reject even the pretense to some of these values. And I think that reflects a broader shift in our society where like the authoritarian pockets of our society are almost metastasizing and spreading to sort of like a full scale kind of like co-optation of the mechanisms of state repression and violence in service of a very small group of people. Um, and so we're seeing I think the full scale conversion of state power into one that's being done for private profit and benefit in a way that does feel a little bit different. And of course the mythologies and propaganda underlying that are very different than what is required in a sort of more liberal democratic environment where you have to figure out ways of cabining state repression and violence and justifying it to the people who aren't really targets of it. So anyway, I think we're seeing now some differences that I think are really scary and make the act of doing this work, i.e., like lawyering, itself risky and dangerous in ways that maybe were only risky and dangerous for many of our clients a few years ago. So those are just some thoughts.
Can I jump in? I think like from our end, I'm following everything that's happening really closely because I still have a lot of community in the US, but also because Canada just tends to follow 5 years later on whatever the US puts out into the world. And also the US is like what's getting legitimized in the US tends to then legitimize like the right word shift in Canada because it normalizes pretty like wild things. But I think that like big shift, the kind of decline in the importance of like liberalism, liberal ideals, and like legitimacy has for lawyers is that often that's where we've found ourselves being able to like successfully play in the contradictions of the law. So, for example, like when people are choosing to do a mass rent strike and the landlord is trying to evict hundreds of people, we've been pretty confident to say the city of Toronto will not want to push out hundreds of working class people all at once. That would kind of they want to play in this game that their eviction courts are fair courts, and that seems pretty unfair in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of like an economic crisis. I think we're like moving to a period where power has been consolidated so much that there isn't a need to play in this legitimacy world anymore. And that totally changes how you can kind of navigate as a lawyer because we are playing in this fake system right now where like you succeed by being like, you are evil, but you don't want to seem evil. So let's like figure out the weird procedural games we can play in court to like stay in that legitimate world. And I think like some of this is like the last kind of like I think it's important to look historically to see how power's been consolidated so much and now no longer need those like illusions of fairness that a lot of our liberal institutions have required. And I think like here in Toronto and in Canada, like COVID was what led to such a consolidation of capital. So there's just like such a monopoly in so many of our industries right now that capital has so much more power. It doesn't really need to like play its like fairness and legitimacy games anymore. I think like on the other side, so like our liberal institutions have failed so many people that people are more willing to like step into a place and believe something that is like a fascist or authoritarian statement because our liberal institutions aren't actually succeeding for working class and poor people or racialized and marginalized people anymore, both in Canada and the US. So it's just opened up the space to consolidate, both like I think economically there's been a consolidation of power, but then politically I think it opened up space to consolidate political power. And that just means there isn't like a need to like to kind of lean on the legitimacy of some of these systems, which I think will require us to really think about how we operate in the legal world differently. Because I can say in Toronto, so much of our practice is based on finding that because the courts are trying to suppress our movements. Like that is the point of the court. It is trying to maintain the status quo. So when people are building movements that are challenging it, it will, of course, kind of try to shut that down. And we've found success in trying to like play the fairness game. And when that fairness game doesn't matter anymore, I think we do just need to think about how we're changing our strategies.
I can go now. So answering the former part of the question, I would say that my first impression of authoritarianism, like many people in my generation, was 2016. And everything that happened then and that succeeded that. That was very much speaking for myself and people in my age group, an age where we were coming into adulthood, trying to learn to navigate this reality, and coming into the very, very drastic reality that all of our effort, all of our organizing, all of our hope and everything for this better future that we were aiming toward can be shattered in a flash like this. So, and of course, this is speaking for myself, my generation, my own background. you can appreciate that the United States has been veering toward authoritarianism since its very inception, depending on what group you belong to. If you are part of the nations that were displaced during the Trail of Tears, then you know that the United States has been authoritarian since at least as far back. If you were part of the nations that have been forcibly brought into the continent to work in plantations across the country and then across the South, then you've known ever since that this land has been so authoritarian in that sense too. So of course, it is this dichotomy of each coming into this realization on our own based on our own particular backgrounds, but also connecting that to the larger scheme of, oh, there's always been authoritarianism and repression against particular nations, any selection of nations at any given time in this subcontinent. And so going into the latter part of the question, is this something new? Is this something old? The answer to that is yes. And just kind of building off of what Seema was mentioning earlier, this is a moment of heightened consolidation of power. This is something that we can see, for instance, with our hyper militarization of violence against our protesters. The fact that we are relying on surveillance, and by we, I mean like the government is relying on surveillance structures developed through the entirety of the war on terror that have been tested abroad and brought back home. The United States is an extremely surveilled country. Edward Snowden disclosed that a decade and a half ago, and it's only gone significantly more intense ever since. The fact that we have such programs like the 1033 program that about 9,000 police departments across the entire country participate in that allow it to inherit military grade weaponry and vehicles and armory from the Department of Defense, something that itself spawned from the wars on drugs and the wars on crime. The fact that through Michelle Alexander, in her thesis for the new Jim Crow, basically posited this thesis that any progress is pulled back, that we abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime. The fact that we have an era of Reconstruction, followed by an age of redemption and lynchings and segregation. We have an age of Jim Crow, subsequently very, very significantly relaxed by Supreme Court, subsequent case law, Milliken v. Bradley, etc. So that, yeah, we don't have de jure segregation any longer, but de facto segregation is very much still the case, especially across the South. Not to say that it doesn't happen in the North, it does more frequently than it should be comfortable for anybody, but it is very much a phenomenon that persists. Can we have a constitutionally recognized right to abortion and reproductive family planning? Sure, temporarily. Can we have strong and robust labor unions? Sure, temporarily. And so there is something ingrained within the very structure of our system of government that makes it so that progress, yeah, it is possible and it has been attained temporarily. So it needs to very much not only the policy position and our orientation toward progress, but also dealing at the very, very systemic structural design of our system of governance that needs itself to be dismantled, reworked, abolished, whatever word resonates with you, so that it does not, by its very reactionary nature, rewrite our system of rights as it so consistently has done for the past quarter century and beyond, even since before its founding.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. And I think to that issue, I'm curious what you all think about like how we respond, right? So like what does it mean to be a pro people lawyer in this moment? Like how do you distinguish principled legal work from work that's inadvertently reinforcing the systems that we're trying to fight?
I could start again, I guess. Although someone else should go first next time. Um, this is a really hard question, and I don't purport to have an answer to it, and I don't think there is an answer to it. It's something that keeps me up every night, I think there's a obvious tension that your question identifies between working as a lawyer within this system and in ways that subvert it while also, legitimating it. And so everybody has to constantly be asking themselves the question of like real deep strategy. How does what I'm doing contribute to growing a movement or to creating or contributing to the conditions within which you know, social movement that's capable of real justice and can thrive. And so for me, I've started to think much more rigorously about the formations that we lawyers find ourselves in. And I've become really excited about shifting legal labor away from nonprofits and away from government jobs and to helping people start their own solo and small practices, and then to building a decentralized but federated network of people in these formations where they're able to do work at their own, they're able to do different kinds of work. They're not siloed like they might be at a single issue organization. They're able to do the work in a way that feels like they have more control over it. And they're also able to do work that is less controlled by philanthropy and by government employers who really limit the kinds of formations that lawyers can get into, and then that also offer them a number of different kinds of combinations of people they can work with and overlap with, and different hubs and both issue area work, but also geographic work that enables them to get into all these different kinds of spaces that they're just not able to in when public interest work is really dominated by nonprofits and government employers. So I'm thinking a lot about personally about and I'm trying to incubate movement infrastructure that will create viable financial models and back office and centralized support for lawyers who want to I basically want to make it just as easy for people and just as stressful or non-stressful or to take a job at a nonprofit as it is to start their own firm. And then also build a vibrant and exciting community of people who are supporting each other in their work.
I skipped.
So,
Yes.
um, so I'm not sure what that was, but anyway, I'm actually thinking much less about the impact of winning individual cases and litigating individual cases, and more about how do we organize lawyers as the professional class or with it as a group within the professional classes into formations that are just by virtue of the organization of all of these people counter authoritarian. So anyway, that's where I'm thinking.
I can go. I think that, okay, let me start with, there's a phrase that I heard in my 1L year of law school that has always stuck with me, which is that I am not doing this work for my community. I am doing this work with my community. And my interpretation is that this work requires a level of
And can we make sure that if we're not, like, if attendees are muted, please?
네, 저기 송금 수수료가 이게 지금 추석이라서 면제되는 거 아니에요? 예. 예. 예.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just circling back, like, I believe that that'll require some amount of ego death. We live in a culture, and for some of us, we have been indoctrinated through law school or otherwise into this mentality that we as lawyers are spearheading a civil rights movement, and we win that through the court, and we are therefore some sort of vanguard into ensuring that people's rights. And I don't believe that that is a helpful mentality. I believe that that ego needs to die and be dissolved into the collective of the people's struggle. What do I mean by this? I mean identifying what is your role relative to the people that you're serving, and what is your personal stake in this struggle. Is this an act of charity? Is this oh, I just feel like doing something nice today, so I'm gonna go represent a marginalized community in a case that they have, or is this something that is resonating with your background, experience, empathy, connections, friendships, loved ones? What is your personal connectivity to the community? And how is this repression affecting you directly or indirectly, and your loved ones and your neighbors and the people, the human beings who are not objects, but fellow humans and members of your human experience on this earth? And so it is very critical, I believe, at this point to really study the framework of movement law, something that I know that Law for Black Lives has been very dedicated into forming and writing and theorizing on. This idea that we are the lawyer of the movement. It's not simply a service, it's not simply an act of altruism or charity. We are members of the movement. We are members of the community. We are members of the neighborhood. And it is this extended solidarity that it sees ourselves within the struggle, and therefore in equal footing with everybody around us, that will then guide how we democratize our knowledge from our legal instruction and practice, democratize the resources to help people access legal tools, whether that be administrative, whether that be judicial, whether that be otherwise, that we can use to democratize the power, because that's what ultimately we want to get at. Decentralize power from this repressive state apparatus and re-democratize it into the hands of the people, bottom up. The people that can then exert their collective voice, deliberated jointly and again collectively, for the benefit of all, rather than the repression guided by a few.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you just said, Sophia. And I think like to add to that, I think part of the kind of removing the power of the lawyer is being part of like sharing the analysis about what the role of the legal system is and how we're actually not going to find our liberation in legal victories. Because I think that helps. I think sometimes people turn to lawyers in like a kind of like for leadership because so much of our like state propaganda has told us that that's how we've either like won victories in the past or um it's like, it's safer for the state and capital for us to fight in court than for us to actually like use our collective power. And so I think it's on us as lawyers and law students and like people who've been trained in that to be part of actually like untraining that knowledge. And I think that's part of the removing the power of the lawyer. I also think like to Alex's point, like how we haven't like the way we haven't gotten ourselves in at our collective like stuck I guess in issue areas and kind of able to move with the like broader like power goals of the people we're like the movements we're a part of is to organize ourselves by being like lawyers to certain movements and certain communities, and that way we can be like what are your goals and we'll think through what the like legal part of that is as opposed to being like this housing issue is like what we're going to work on, because I think that then pretends like it's not about power and like you could just have like legal steps that will get to a victory on that issue. I wanted to say like one thing about just like the framing of the question, because I've heard this before where people are like, we should, how do we like not legitimize the system? And I just like a part of how we talk about it in Toronto is that almost like a lot of the times people are finding themselves in the legal system isn't by choice. Like the legal system is used as a repressive apparatus against both our movements and just generally against like poor and marginalized people. And so when people are like, for many people, there isn't a choice to ignore the legal system. If we're doing like defensive and like anti-retaliatory work, the ignoring it would mean, I don't know, you've been arrested and you're just like, to not legitimize the system, I'm going to ignore it. So I think that's like people have asked us to be part of the like strategizing because it's clear that the legal system is being used as part of the tool to demobilize movements and remove power from people that are coming together. And in that way, I don't see it as like legitimizing the system because I'm like, the system's being used. We need to help on that front of the like repressive part against our system. And then we end up doing very, very little non-defense. Like we almost all of our work is defensive because we do ask that question of when we're not doing defensive work, how are we not building up the like strength of the system? And often the reforms that are won through more like affirmative legal or like lawsuits to try to win something do end up strengthening the system and legitimizing it or just distracting people's energy into legal fights and away from much more like collectively held and collective power. So we end up more in the defensive lane where people don't really have a choice and are stuck in courts.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, and I guess just as like a follow-up, open to anybody, but I'll start with you, Seema, that kind of just working in kind of in community, as opposed to like, as Sophia said, like as opposed to like working for the community or something like that. It's like, actually being a part of these movements. Like, I wonder if you can kind of just give an example so people can get a sense of kind of like how that, like a story of like where that there was success there, like whether it's identifying issues you wouldn't have otherwise, or gotten more people involved, or like what does that kind of look like on the ground?
I think so. On the one hand, I think it requires like people actually not like hiding in their legal offices and actually like being in community with people. Like I think the idea that like people just kind of like will come to you with this like very like comfortable legal project and then you can just work on it in the corner, I think isn't how you work in it. I think all of us also just come from different communities that are organizing or from different movements that are fighting. So it wasn't like inorganic in that way. But when when COVID started in Toronto, and there were at some point there was huge rent strikes that were started with a few of the different like left community-based organizations because people just couldn't pay their rent. And what it looked like to work in community was at that point, most lawyers were like, we cannot be anywhere near people, like we're working from home. Whereas like most working people were still having to go to work and still in like buses with people, like people didn't actually have the luxury to stay at home. And it meant that like we just like spent a lot of time. Like I remember our first 2 months of starting CJC, we just kind of like brought our cars to the neighborhood and just like worked in the neighborhood with people. And we were there for like you it's like about building deeper relationships with people so that you can actually get to a place of trust. Because the fact is, like, the organizing we're talking about will require risk. And to be able to do that with people, we have to be in relationship with people. I think like a lot of it is also just not saying no. Like at the beginning when people were starting their rent strikes, every lawyer they turned to was like, that's illegal. You're going to get people evicted. This is too dangerous. And organizers were like, people are getting evicted every day. Like we're not causing the eviction crisis. Like the economic crisis is causing the eviction crisis. And lawyers were like, we won't represent you. We disagree with your tactics. And we were like, okay, tell us what you're trying to do. We'll figure out the legal piece of this. And it's not on us. Like if you're actually like building trust with people and people are taking this step, it's not on us to tell you what's right or what's wrong. And that's been a lot of like a like really important piece of being able to do it in community.
That's wonderful. Alec or Sophia, if you have any thoughts there.
Yes. So an experience from the Project South perspective. Now, this precedes me joining Project South, but it is something that I've learned that my supervisor, the program director for a legal program, Azare Shashihani, has worked on in the past is going back to this utilities framework and how undocumented people who cannot provide a social security number are denied access to these essential, very critical utilities access. She has researched that for over a decade, I believe, or around a decade-ish at this point, and has written several pieces, done a lot of advocacy about that. And at some point around, I believe it was 2019, came to learn about a situation in the city of LaGrange in Georgia. Now, what was going on is there were two policies in place. Number one, that we learned from a religious leader in the area is this very same policy that denies access to utilities to people who cannot provide a social security number. The second policy that we learned through the NAACP is that the city has additionally penalized those who owe fines or fees or any other outstanding debt to the city, have their utilities shut off and used whatever utilities credit or money that they have paid into paying the debt to the city, and will not be allowed. The utilities will not be reopened until all outstanding debts to the city are paid. And so we have this something that affects considerably people who have found themselves victims of the carceral criminal system, which in the city of LaGrange was primarily Black folks. And so we have this policy that is affecting an undocumented, primarily Latino community, as well as a subjected to carceral systems Black community. And it was uniting the both communities into a single case and advocacy and organizing and mobilizing to pressure the city into rescinding both policies and permitting anybody, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their race, access to these very, very, very necessary utilities, mediums of utility. And Project South was involved in a lot of the organizing, was leading a lot of that organizing. When it got to the point where the city was non-responsive, was a plaintiff and very active participant in the litigation against the city, it ended in a settlement that rescinded both policies and allowed significantly greater access for both communities. And all throughout, just piggybacking off of something that Seema was mentioning earlier, there was the community at the forefront. We were, as the attorneys, were the legal support. We helped direct whatever access the actual vanguard of this movement wanted to reach in the judicial and legal arena, but otherwise we were at the behest of the community that was impacted and that knew how to mobilize around it. And so it was that decentering and it was that uplifting, using the platform that we have through our legal training, etc., and seeding that platform to the community that is the one that needs these services.
Let me see. I was looking at the.
Can I add something? I realized you'd asked about a specific example and I like went off and forgot to tell you the example. Just because I think sometimes when we talk about like defensive work, it doesn't necessarily click how that can lead to a win. So in the example I was talking about, like hundreds of people went on run strike. And immediately what the landlord did was to try to evict everyone. They were like, we don't need to deal with your organizing. We'll just evict you and then that'll stop it. And that's like partly why we have such a belief in the importance of defensive legal work, is that what we're seeing is often your like enemy just won't contend with you. They'll be like, the courts will deal with them. We don't need to like deal with whatever like power you're trying to like build up. And so they brought everyone to our like eviction courts. And what we did is people just asked us, they said, try to make the legal mechanism irrelevant because we can build power on the ground. This is like diverting. They're just like not contending with us because of these eviction hearings. And so we found every way, every random idea to first like collectivize things that people wouldn't have to individually deal with hundreds of eviction applications, which would have taken all the energy out of organizing, but then just like overly complicated. So basically the eviction stalled. And I think like 3.5 years later, we were still in eviction court on these like random eviction applications. And what that meant was that the landlord had to actually, both the landlord and the state at some point, when like tons of other buildings started to see that they could go on rent strike and not be evicted, had to like actually negotiate with communities that were organizing at this time. And like in Toronto at this point, no one that's ever been on rent strike has been evicted, which has meant for many communities that are like in the crossroads of displacement, it's actually been a really effective mechanism to like stop displacement because you like stop the ability to evict out of the buildings. And during that huge rent strike at the beginning of COVID, people were able to get tons of money back from their landlord when they lost their jobs and were unable to pay their rent. They were able to get a settlement to like actually get things fixed in their buildings, and still have like really strong tenant unions that are now part of the like left organizing in the city. And so I think like sometimes this defensive work doesn't like it, the legal work doesn't look like we want a policy. It actually looks like just allowing people to build the power and removing the like things that get in the way of that. So I just wanted to add that example.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. So one thing I'm, just shifting gears a little bit that I'm curious about is like working, like working in these areas, and in particular, like working in this way where you are really kind of like working in the community, things like that. Like considering the urgency of some of these issues, both like whether it's like an individual community that's like there's under attack that you're doing some of this defensive work, um, or just like the urgencies of just the issues you're working with and like the direction things are going right now. Like how do you kind of balance that urgency with like like sustainability, like both personally and like within your organizations? Because I think this is like authoritarian like thrives on burnout, right? So what kind of things do you do to kind of stay grounded and make this work kind of in the long term?
Well, so I think this is a really crucial and sometimes difficult conversation to have because the, at least speaking about the United States and the nonprofit industrial complex in the United States, it has been in significant respects a failure. Not only because it hasn't meaningfully disturbed the underlying systems that it's ostensibly fighting against, but the work culture and environment in both government jobs and in the nonprofit world in the United States is not a good one. It's deeply unstrategic in a lot of ways. It's easily distracted. It's not meaningfully connected to movements. But even internally, they're actually just not fun places to work for the most part. They're filled with toxic behavior. They're filled with a lack of real urgency and focus on what matters. And I mean, there's overlapping problems, of course. Their internal culture and the at the administrative levels of universities and nonprofits, what they do is really dictated by the donor class. And so there's all kinds of different problems, but it leads to just massive amounts of time, energy, and money spent on consulting and talking internally. And anyway, so this is, in my opinion, and I've only come to this realization after years of flailing about, but it's just not a place where revolutionary work, or even effective anti-authoritarian or anti-fascist work is going to happen. And so I think what I've done, I can only speak for myself, is I've tried to surround myself with people who in smaller formations, people who I have a lot of trust in, people who hold me accountable, but who also know when to go dancing or sing music or who want to just go see some art with me, who want to go to a weird puppet show. Um, like, and then infusing that kind of spirit into the actual work that we're doing, into the collaborations that we're doing with artists or musicians or whatever. So the arts are a big, you can probably tell from my comments, the arts are a big thing that I do to keep sharp and to keep, my spirits up. But also like we need to break free of the kind of nonprofit work culture that kind of doesn't think of that stuff as part of the movement that we're doing. Um, and so my key takeaways are smaller formations that better enable accountability, because only the people that you're really close to can actually hold you accountable to your own values. So creating more of those smaller things and then federating them and decentralizing that accountability is actually a key to like effective restorative justice work, effective transformative justice work, but it's also, I think, a key to lawyering that's going to actually be effective. And lawyers are really far behind at putting themselves in these kinds of formations. They tend to work in big law firms or nonprofit organizations or like government offices where there's no genuine, meaningful relationships of accountability. And then we rely on these kind of hierarchical structures that have gotten quite toxic and full of mistrust. So to me, that's kind of how I have been thinking about it.
I really love that answer, Alec, and very much agree. People are everything. The people that you have are everything. These, if we are alone or struggling through all this on our own, it's insurmountable. It's impossible. It is the most overwhelming thing. But we can get a different energy going on, piggybacking off what Alec was mentioning, and also just spread out the overwhelm, the fatigue, the horrors that we're facing when we have these people to rely on. And for some folks, that's gonna be a lot of people, a very vast social support network. I don't do that. I am way more introverted. For me, it's just having 3, 4 people that are everything to me, that I can share all of myself with them and everything that I'm going through and everything that I'm feeling and everything that I need. And that is something that I very, very, very extremely highly advise, because people are everything. And what relationship that changes, that depends on your own circumstances, that depends on your own preference. It may all be friends, it may be significant other, it may be family, it may be definitely therapist. Oh my gosh, please make sure to have a therapist. If I didn't see my therapist frequently, I would go mad. Like, if you cannot do it weekly because it costs money, then please try to do it every other week. If you cannot have a therapist every other week, please do not do it. Do not spread it out any more than just like every third week, because that is so necessary. And our profession, just our profession in general, has such horrible, just so abysmal mental health outcomes. Please have a therapist. um, and yeah, just much of our identity becomes so intrinsically shaped by this work that we're doing that it is also important to remember this is a part of us. I'm not saying that we are not this work that we're doing, but you're not exclusively, again, something that Alec was getting at, that there's more of you. And do not lose touch with that more of you that you are, whether that is arts, whether that is hiking, whether that is petting a cat. There is more to you. This work can be very sad. It is to me. and I know that it is for everybody else in this call too, this work can be super central to you, and there are other things that are also super central to you. So do not ever lose touch with that.
Yeah, I feel like community is such a big part of like how to stay grounded in it. And like law school tries to destroy that in you. Like I remember my first week of law school when they do that thing where they're like, there's an athlete in your class or whatever. Like one of the things they said was, call this week, make sure to call people in your community because they won't hear from you for 3 years. And I was like, that is an absolutely insane thing to say, that you should disconnect yourself from everyone that's not a lawyer. Because guess what? Those are going to be the people that hold you accountable. Those are going to be the people that like kind of allow you to be your full human self. And like I know the community that like Alex saying, I think it has looked like really deep relationships with other people in like struggle, but that doesn't mean like other lawyers. It means just like other people that are in it, but not just in our work, also like going dancing and cooking dinners. And I think like each of us brings a different part of ourselves to build that community and making room for like ourselves to like grow that part of it too, because I think that is where the sustainability comes from. I also think like when we built CJC, we really intentionally were like it needs we don't want it to be like the normal nonprofit structure. We also don't want to just be solo practitioners because I think it's actually really hard alone to do work in a sustainable way. So having just 5 of us means we're actually able to get rest and know there's someone else that like will do the work with the same depth of relationships and same approach, and allow you to like step away when you need to. And I think that's like really, really necessary. And like part of it is just the like time we're in. Part of it is like it's so draining to be working in the like enemy's world. Like the courts we're in for people that like are in like criminal court or eviction court, like all of those kind of like repressive systems, you're constantly in like fighting mode, which is so like in conflict with kind of like what actually like liberation feels like. So I think like really making space for that and knowing like that's where a lot of the exhaustion's coming from, and having people that, yeah, allow you to be your fuller self.
I see that we're at time. I feel like I could have done like heard from you all like all day, but I will let you go. But thank you all so much. This was super helpful, really amazing discussion. I hope that everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. And hopefully we'll talk to you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Great.
so much. This was great.